article on dealing with AI as a wicked problem. Now, those of you who know the wicked problem literature will realise that there's probably no greater wicked problem than the rise and demise of social cohesion. As I said, you just have to listen to the radio, television and newspapers. So with this wicked problem, I'm reminded, my granddaughter said to me last week with Christmas approaching rapidly, she said from the back seat, she's 13 going on 25, she said, Nanny, she said, what do you really, really want for Christmas? I thought for a minute and I said, well, darling, I'd like a magic wand to solve all the world's problems. She said, well, Nanny, not many people would say that. Now, why we would like a magic wand to solve the problem of social cohesion, unless anyone in the audience has got a spare one, I can't promise that we will have magic wands available to you at the end of the session. I can promise you that the panellists are representative of all the major ingredients in the issue of social cohesion, and they have promised to provide many magic wands in their responses. So, the concept of social cohesion is multifaceted, socio-cultural, and hugely varied in how we understand it. Its links to education, democracy, and the public good of education, fortunately, have been recently revitalised. Now, you've heard some of this, but it's important to remember the context. The student encampments of April 24, continuing reports of gender-based violence, and very public incidents of racism on higher education campuses, which apparently are continuing to grow, and why Professor Greg Craven is apparently doing another inquiry into it. These pointed to a decline in social cohesion, making a turning point for Australian higher education. Hatred and violence threatened what I believe are the basis, not of just higher education, but education. Ideals of mutual respect and support, and acceptances of differences and tolerance, and arguing our perspectives without damaging or killing each other, as we saw in America. These issues challenge not only the sector's approach to freedom of expression, safety and institutional autonomy, but really, as has been mentioned already, the very foundations of public trust in the higher education sector, and particularly universities as public institutions, but all the fabulous independent sectors as well. From a regulatory standpoint, providers of higher education and governing bodies have obligations to assure student and staff wellbeing, probably standards 2 and 6 most prominently, and to ensure their safety in what is an exciting and enriched learning environment, the freedom of speech and academic freedom. And moreover, as Ilyeva Trikova last year made the point, quote, the influence of higher education on social cohesion should be regarded as one of its main extrinsic contributions. It's our responsibility. So this session explores how social cohesion grounded in trust is increasingly central to issues of quality, risk and governance in higher ed, and how our regulatory expectations have to shift in response. And you've heard Mary talking about that very eloquently in the earlier session. As part of TEQSA's ongoing work to improve the system, responses to issues that threaten social cohesion, and with considered input from all of you, we held social cohesion roundtables as part of TEQSA's social cohesion project, and recently released the SRE on student grievances and complaints. We also offered guidance on balancing lawful protest, academic freedom and campus safety, and will soon release an update on managing external actors on campus. We now also have the action plan addressing gender-based violence in higher ed, the National Student Ombudsman, welcome, and the final report and principles of the Expert Council on University Governance. So really, there are no excuses for inaction. We have to act now. Consequently, the challenge posed to our fabulous panel and our audience, you, today, is to consider how to practically embed social cohesion in higher education quality assurance practices to enhance higher education processes and outcomes, and importantly, to renew public trust in the sector. So I'll now turn to our wonderful panellists and ask them to address that wicked problem, but giving us some mini solutions to it. First of all, we have Hashini Panditharatne, who's Director of the Racism at Uni Study, Australian Human Rights Commission, and we heard the Minister mention how next month we're going to get the report, and while Hashini will not be telling us every detail of that report, she is going to give us the highs, the lows and the challenges, but going to also give us some solutions to how we can deal with them. Over to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that wonderful introduction. Hello, everyone. It's really nice to be here. So yes, as Elizabeth mentioned, the Minister did talk a little bit about the Racism at Uni study that is being led by the Race Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission. The Racism at Uni study is the first national study to investigate the prevalence, nature and impact of racism in Australian universities. It's a mixed methods research, and one of the most fundamental components of our fieldwork has been a national online survey that went out to all staff and students across the sector. The survey has concluded, and as the Minister mentioned again, we received over 76,000 staff and student responses. Now, one of the main insights, one of the really strong insights that has come through from the study is that staff and students see universities as institutions that should be accountable to their communities. That means a lot of things, obviously, but overwhelmingly, staff and students who participated have expressed deep dissatisfaction and mistrust in certain accountability processes, and it's going to come as no surprise that the one that was mentioned the most is reporting and complaints handling processes. Now, accessible, fair, equitable complaints handling processes aren't just about resolving individual issues. It's broader than that. They're a part of broader quality assurance, and if done well, can definitely contribute towards a culture of safety, a culture of inclusion, and social cohesion, essentially, on campuses. So I'm going to read out a couple of statistics for you that's come through in our survey. I should just say that these figures could slightly change because we're just waiting on some final checking on our data. But almost 70% of survey respondents reported experiencing racism at university, either direct or indirect. But of those, only around 5% of students decided to lodge a formal complaint, and just below 7% of staff decided to lodge a formal complaint. Now, we know that there are significant barriers to reporting any kind of racism, but the most common reasons cited by study participants for choosing not to report was the fear of repercussions if they reported, and a lack of confidence that reporting via a complaint system would lead to any kind of change. What was also concerning is that quite a few staff and students said that they didn't know how to report, and they also didn't think that they could find out the relevant information if they wanted to make a complaint. Of those that did report, there's also deep dissatisfaction in terms of their experience of complaints handling processes and the outcomes. So a couple of quick stats: over 60% of academics who reported said that they were very dissatisfied with how the university responded to their complaint. And it's similar statistics for professional staff, for international students, and for domestic students as well. And many staff and students reported the feeling of being unable to express themselves safely. And there was quite a strong link with that finding in terms of how academic freedom and freedom of speech is being inconsistently applied in complaints handling processes to often minimise or deny people's experiences of racism. So what do we do with those findings? What do we want to achieve? So I think we want to achieve accountable universities with trusted, accessible, effective complaint systems supported by independent oversight. And I've got a few suggestions here to think through. So the first is requiring universities to provide annual de-identified reporting on racism complaints. I think there is one university who has started doing that already, and that could be a better practice that the sector looks to. Another suggestion is ensuring that referral pathways between each university and the National Student Ombudsman is clear and consistent, and that those pathways are actively promoted and communicated to university communities so that people know what their options are. Along the same vein, I'm just going to flip my page here, increasing awareness of university complaints processes themselves by communicating clearly how to make a complaint, what kind of support is available to people who do make a complaint, how long the complaints process is going to take, as well as what the likely outcomes are. And this can be done through things like de-identified case studies, which is often quite effective in terms of practical communication, as well as reviewing complaint policies to ensure an explicit reference is made to racism and protection against victimisation. Training is another big one, so training staff who are handling complaints to ensure that responses are culturally capable and trauma-informed with tailored content on anti-racism, as well as the experiences of different groups that experience racism. We've got to ensure that complaints units and equity officers are adequately resourced and staffed. And just finally, a suggestion is to implement multiple complaints avenues, including anonymous options. I hope I've stuck to my time limit, Elizabeth, but I'll hand back over to you.
Absolutely fantastic. But as the Minister said, this is going to be hard reading. What's the date for the release?
Look, it'll be provided to government by the end of this year. In terms of when it'll be made public, we're hoping for early next year.
Okay, so I was just thinking about people before Christmas picking up the report, but okay, we've got a bit of time before we actually delve into it. But thank you for the fantastic work has been done. So thank you. Our second panellists bring the crucial Indigenous perspective to these issues. And Renae Isaacs-Guthridge currently is a lecturer at the Kurongkurl Yinung and a PhD candidate at Edith Cowan. But she mentioned that she's actually about to move to a senior lectureship. So congratulations.
That's perfect.
No pressure.
She's joining our final speaker. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Kaya Nunakort. Hello, everyone. My name is Renae Isaacs-Guthridge. I'm a Noongar and Yamatji yoga with matriarchal connections to countries both across the nation. So if any of you have been to the West, I'm kind of hanging out in the southwest. I live about 2.5 hours south of Perth, which is in Busso, which is pretty cool because now you can have a direct flight from Melbourne to Busso. It's quite quick. which is nice. I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Wurrung and Bunurong Wurrung peoples of the East Kulin Nation, and pay my respects in particular to Uncle Perry for his welcome this morning. So in our research, which was led by Dr. Mary-Ann McDonald, of more than 500 Indigenous and non-Indigenous students across Western Australia, we explored how young people experience education, not just how they perform within it. So as a Noongar and Yamatji Yorga, these findings speak deeply to what we already know as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Our young people desire education, they show agency, but yet they continue to face systemic obstacles. So the issue isn't about building aspiration for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, it's about building systems worthy of that aspiration and of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students' trust. And if you listen to Billy this morning, I think he explained pretty quickly how he built his trust quite well within Western Sydney University. So within our findings across every measure, the belief in the value of education, the confidence that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students have, family support and future hopes was both reflected across Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal students equally and positively, so equally. So in fact, Indigenous students in our study were slightly more likely to say that finishing high school was important. Their families are just as invested, their belief in their own ability was strong, and that's a profound finding, particularly when we are so often problematised. And yet, fewer Aboriginal students said they intended to go to university after Year 12. Why? Not because of lack of aspiration, but because of the conditions of trust, safety, and belonging that shape these decisions. So the trust deficit doesn't sit within our students, it sits within our education systems. So trust for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities isn't abstract, it's lived, it's relational, it's demonstrated through respect, through reciprocity, and through accountability. And in our studies, Aboriginal students were twice as likely as their non-Aboriginal students or non-Indigenous students to say that they would attend school to maintain the respect of a teacher they admired. So this speaks volumes. It shows that trust is built through relationships, relationality, and through the way that we walk alongside one another. So this is where social cohesion must begin, not with policy statements, but with relational practices. So what does this mean for how we embed social cohesion, which I think is a bit of a loaded term, but that's another conversation, in higher education governance? So first, and I've already said to it, it's the relational quality that's important. We need to look beyond compliance measures. We need to think about cultural safety, belonging, and the strength of staff-student relationships. Social cohesion can't be captured just in numbers and data. We need to think about cultural governance, and I know Melinda this morning said we can't measure cultural governance, but we can think about cultural governance and how we might establish that within our organisations. So I think that comes back to thinking about it from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspective. How do we embed Indigenous leadership? And I know that that is happening in some institutions better than others. How do we think about Indigenous data sovereignty and genuine partnership in governance and evaluation? So as Professor Maggie Walter's work reminds us, deficit-framed data erodes trust, strength-based data builds trust. So the final thing I'd like to say is trust indicators. So aspirational gaps reflect institutional distrust. People don't aspire to university because they don't trust, not student failure. So as we are aware, institutions trust. So we need to ask ourselves, are institutions trustworthy in how we lead how we listen, and how we respond. And finally, I think I'm coming up to my 5 minutes. Embedding social cohesion means moving from measuring access, so we always talk about access and equity, to evidencing belonging, like Billy said this morning, from auditing compliance to demonstrating care. Our young people are already doing their part. The question is whether our education systems can now rise to meet that trust with safety, accountability, and respect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Renae. And you reminded us that UWS is doing some fantastic stuff, but I'm sure lots of other organisations are doing it. And the issue, I think we cannot regulate, in a sense, for social cohesion. We've got, standards there. As you said, it's a different perspective on culture, and it has to be stepped every moment of the day through the university and higher education sector. Our third speaker is Associate Professor David Slucki, who's the lead investigator of the Campus Cohesion project at Monash University. And some of you would have seen reports of the work that they are doing and he is doing. And it seems to me that that's one example of what we might be doing. Not the only, but one. David.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and you guys are both a hard act to follow, so I just want to start by saying I concur with everything. And I thought there's so much food for thought in data and in these observations. And I'm just thinking about, the observations about the things you put in place to create a sense of belonging for Indigenous students are also like universal, right? I mean, they'll benefit Indigenous students, which has to be a priority of our sector, but they'll also benefit every group of students who feels marginalised and a lack of belonging. So I think that's so important. I do want to say there's no magic wand, sorry, Elizabeth. I've been trying to find it, but it doesn't exist. And so kind of with some humility, I just want to talk briefly about a couple of the things that we've been doing that are sort of solutions focused, and a couple of the recommendations that we're trying to sort of roll out through our work. So I'm overseeing two major projects. One is the Campus Cohesion project at Monash that I co-lead with Dr. Susan Carland of sociology. Susan's a sociologist of religion and a scholar of Islamophobia, and I'm a historian of Jewish history. And so we're looking at the experiences of particularly Jewish and Muslim students and Palestinian students at Monash over the last 2 years, but we're also sort of looking more broadly at the campus population. And we're kind of in the early phase of analysing data there. And my other project that I oversee is the Monash Initiative for Rapid Research into Anti-Semitism, and that's where I think I've got some really already clear insights that I think are useful for the sector. I hope are useful for the sector. So as part of that, and what I should say at the outset is I work on anti-Semitism, but I don't work only for the benefit of Jewish staff and students. The work that we do on anti-Semitism is for the benefit of campuses as a whole and Australian society as a whole. In other words, what we do around this topic has much bigger implications for tackling discrimination and all other forms of racism and hatred throughout Australian society. So we don't see it in a vacuum. We see it as part of a bigger problem of racism in Australia. So a couple of the practical things that we keep seeing as really important and that keep coming up in conversations. One is that, thinking about a TEQSA or a Department of Education, we need to take a partnership approach with universities. We need to work together, and also between universities, see this as a sector-wide issue that we have to address, rather than we only clean up our own backyard and we're done, right? We have to model, in other words, good behaviour across the sector, which I know isn't always easy in a competitive environment, but it's crucially important because if we're not thinking of this from 30,000 feet, then none of us are safe from it, right? It could come back. Even if we get it right in one of our institutions, the fact that it exists down the road, that threat will always linger to us. And as part of that, the role of leadership is really important here, maybe understated in some ways. You know, when I think about the ways in which the sheer ferocity of discourse on campuses and the speed at which it exploded after October 7, 2023, I think one of the things that caught a lot of universities, it was something that caught a lot of universities by surprise. There was no kind of handbook for how to deal with the on-campus hostility that we were witnessing. It had existed in certain ways in the past, but it sort of came to the fore in very public and very damaging ways. And so the role of leaders in recognising the challenges and the harm, in working with the affected populations, and that's where I feel really lucky at Monash University, and I can talk really in detail about that. But you know, my Vice-Chancellor, Professor Sharon Pickering, has been just an amazing listener to the student body and meeting regularly with Jewish and Muslim student societies and the Monash Student Association. And she'll be the first to admit we don't always get these things right, but the listening and the giving space is a really important first step. You know, we hear a lot about policy change, and there are ways in which policies need to be tightened and better, but policy change alone isn't going to fix our problems. So punishing people more or punishing them better is not going to stop people behaving in the ways in which we've seen towards each other. The work we do really focuses on culture change. How do we create culture change inside institutions beyond thinking that if we punish people better, then that's going to solve our problems? Because we know, like, you know, we all hear discourse around crime, and I don't want to comment on that except to say, like, crime persists even though there are laws. And similarly, you know, we're a microcosm of that at universities too. So we sort of have to think, again, more holistically about what are all the different things, the different ingredients that go into this recipe. And one of those final ingredients that I want to point to is a thing that I think has been really successful from our perspective, and I hope is going to be a model for this more generally. And that is that we've been running training sessions for university executive teams and frontline staff to basically help them understand, A, what is anti-Semitism, right? And you know, knowing that that's a contested term and an idea, but maybe more importantly, what's happening with the Jewish students and staff on your campuses? Why are they so in distress? And what are you not understanding about their context, their culture, their identity, the ways in which they're experiencing these things? Like I said, we focus on anti-Semitism, but that doesn't mean universities shouldn't also be undertaking these trainings on First Nations people and students and staff, on Muslim students and staff, on international students and staff from a range of different places. It's a big undertaking, it's a commitment, but I think helping our leaders understand the problems that they're facing is a really crucial first step. And the final thing that we've observed, and I've spoken to a lot of university leaders over the past 12 months, and one of the things that everyone, almost universally, is crying out for is, how do we have better conversations on our campuses? Whether they're in the classroom or around the campus, how do we create an environment where robust, constructive debates and discussions are possible, where we recognise others' humanity, where we don't marginalise people for disagreement? And I know the issues that we're talking about in this work are very hot right now. But, you know, we need to focus again on culture shift. How do we make our core mission possible so that all students can A, learn better, and B, become the leaders of tomorrow that can actually lead rather than just sort of learn to be entrenched in this polarisation and this culture of yelling and incrimination and social media discourse. So those are just some of I'm sorry, there is no magic wand, and we work on a theory of change that says we need to do stuff that's very hyper-local, what is happening at your institution, and we just need to try stuff. And sometimes it's going to work, and if it doesn't work, we need to evaluate it and measure it, and then try something else, and be really courageous about what we try and take risks. And it's not easy. Like, that stuff's not easy, and you put your head above the parapet when you do it. But it's hugely important to do. So thanks for inviting me. I'm really grateful to be on this amazing panel.
Thank you. And that capacity to engage in difficult conversations, to take the different perspectives. I remember as a young academic at what was then Kurongkurl CAE, I had to teach a course on argumentation and rhetoric. And I was about 1 week ahead of the students, I have to admit. But that sort of seems to have gone. And it seems to me a crucial part of dealing with the issue of social cohesion. We don't have to agree with each other, but we have to understand where we're coming from, and we have to have the appropriate tools to argue our case, because otherwise what's the point of education? So thank you, David, for all the work that you and your colleagues are doing. Again, not last, last but not least, is our last speaker, Professor Shamit Saggar, who brings you cannot have social cohesion without equity. It sort of is a must, a sort of foundation. And that's equity for Indigenous, it's actually equity, and we haven't spoken, I noticed the students mentioned it today, another area of hatred and bigotry, the whole issue of disabled staff and disabled students, and I wondered if that came up in the work that you were doing, but that's perhaps a topic for another day. But as David said, the capacity to deal with difficult conversations goes right across bullying, harassment, hatred, and all of those sorts of things. So Shamit brings that particular focus on the issue of student equity and success as Executive Director of the Australian Centre for Student Equity and Success. Over to you, Shamit.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I have the great pleasure of agreeing with everyone so far, but I just want to... That's good. But just wait to see what I've got to say. But I'm just going to carry on with the last the speaker, just line of continuity. They used an expression, these things have become hot. They've definitely become hot. This is definitely something that's happened in Australia of late. We had significant student protests on our campuses with most university senior management caught unawares from the best I could see. And I wonder why. Look, I'll share an anecdote. I happened to be with two very senior university leaders at the time some of these encampments were sort of sprouting up. And I was personally surprised, if not shocked, that they themselves were upset about the students protesting, as opposed to any particular action they took. And I said to them, my words fell on deaf ears, that these students were being politicised. They wanted to be politicised. That's good. They're dealing with difference. They're dealing with division. The very points that we made by panel members beforehand. What is the point of a university if it doesn't have a way of dealing with difference? The very point of intellectual integrity and rigour is to deal with a kind of contestation, if you want, of different perspectives. And all perspectives may be right, depending upon where you stand. But to somehow imagine the university as an inappropriate place, well, I mean, I'm at a loss for words, frankly, at a complete loss. So I just want to reinforce the point that we were probably seeing, at short notice, because of an unpredictable event in the Middle East, the politicisation, or the partial politicisation of a generation of young people in Australia, mainly on campuses, not exclusively. The same thing would have been going on 50 years ago with Vietnam. Yeah. In my generation, I come from the UK, it was the miners' strike when they took on Mrs. Thatcher and got a bloody nose. It could have been the Greenham Common women. I mean, politicisation is not a bad thing. I mean, and radicalisation is also, people feeling very strongly about it. And I endorse all these things taking place on and off campuses so long as it's going on within the law. When it's outside the law, of course, it's another discussion. But we should be trying to embrace this rather than say, why are they protesting? Blindingly obvious why they're protesting, on all sides, by the way. On all sides, not just one side. So the first point I want to make is that I think we just need to remind ourselves that we are in the university business. We're in the education business. And this actually touches upon quite a few themes that have cropped up in the course of the discussion during the day. I'm particularly reminded of the session dealing with, I think, some regulatory issues, I think just before lunch. There are headwinds. Why are we finding this difficult to deal with and converting it into how we would regulate or look after a sector and encourage these kind of differences and disputes? Well, the first is, and I'm a professor for almost, I've been in this profession almost 40 years. We actually have values that go back to the 16th century. When I came to Australia in 2019, I was recruited by UWA, and you'll see its motto in Latin is seek wisdom. If you walk around that campus, or indeed any of our sandstone campuses, you'll notice that you feel like you're walking around in the Middle Ages in Siena, like the Renaissance. And so we have long-standing values that have to do with the integrity of ideas and testing them. So it becomes a little bit difficult for academics, I'm not going to get off the hook, but to suggest that there's anything other than a level playing field, that their campuses are anything other than places where you can participate on an even basis. I don't think that often is the case, and that takes us actually back to the study that Hashini and others are responsible for. This is long overdue and it's long needed. I think as another speaker made this point, it's quite missing the point that there's questions about the survey. Let's pay attention to some of the findings, and we can improve surveys as they go along. Every time there's been an empirical attempt to look at these difficult, awkward issues, hot issues, wicked issues, whatever they are, yes, of course, people recoil. They say, why are you doing this? The implication being that somehow you are calling out academics and professors and universities as being discriminatory. Well, places can be discriminatory without intent. You don't have to be people waking up in the morning and saying, let's exclude, let's discriminate. Our practices ourselves as professors and university administrators may have a chilling effect on different communities. We certainly know that empirically in relation to some of the student equity groups that my centre is responsible for. So I make the point, we've got a headwind to do with intergenerational centuries worth of values. But linked to that, there's this other thing, which is that it is actually a sector, my sector, the university sector, which is provider-centric. Professors rule. You will receive the education that you will receive on the basis of myself and my colleagues. It's not user-centric at all. And what we're trying to do in Australia is trying to shift that in favour of users. We call them students. The same thing is happening in healthcare. It's also happening in the legal services profession. It's happening in financial services. For my sins, I'm ex-legal and financial regulator. And whenever you turn that around, the profession often says, why would you want to do that? Well, because users matter. Their experience matters. And if you get big things wrong, the reputation of your industry then suffers and they don't come back. Or they have a bad experience, they put other people off. And that clearly is happening in pockets, significant pockets in higher education in Australia. The evidence we pick up suggests that that sort of chilling effect is there. So long-term values, which we can't go back to the 16th century, sadly, but the short-term values to do with providers being more important than users, I think we can have an attempt at that. I think TEQSA has got a very important role in trying to shift that around. Last thing briefly, if I can. My centre is responsible for trying to bring about a degree of rigour around evidence on the student equity programmes that universities have. All 39 of them have been busy putting these programmes together since the days of Bradley, 16 odd years ago. And what we really want to know is which of these are working. We don't propose to have the last word, we just want to have the first word, and we're introducing a lot of evidence and rigour, and that's been picked up by, in particular, the ATEC as and when it's sort of on its own feet. That's good, because you don't want to be a Vice-Chancellor investing in a program that doesn't work. Of course you want to invest in programs that work. So kind of what works mentality or framework is useful. Now, the reason why I foreground that point is I think there's actually a read across to the issue we're dealing with here. I don't think it's unreasonable for the regulator to say we expect universities to show some degree of rigour, frankly, some degree of curiosity. That was a word that came up early this morning. Actually looking at themselves in a sort of semi-critical way and looking at where the hotspots might be. Is there early evidence of any group that is being excluded or feeling that the university isn't for them? If those attitudes are prevailing when people are coming in, are they getting worse or better for particular groups? This sense that everyone comes to the front gate of university entirely free of the experiences that they have, the prejudices that they've experienced, or indeed they have themselves. The idea that somehow that sort of lifts as part of a magic veil is really, frankly, pushing the argument, okay? So we are, in a sense, a reflection. So I would see TEQSA in this sense asking regulated entities, the universities, to show some rigour and to collect evidence. And this kind of evidence is difficult to collect by its very nature. No one puts their hands up and says, yes, I'm racist. That's not how this social research works. So other regulators in other fields, when you are dealing with something that's social taboo, as it were, they also have things like whistleblowers. Mystery shopping is a well-known regulatory device to find out what's happening at the chalk face. There's a whole plethora of these things. Time prevents me to going into this. But I suggest that actually this is an important culture change for TEQSA to sort of expect that degree of serious-mindedness from the regulated community, my community, myself, of us. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I'm sure TEQSA and my colleagues will take that on board. Of course, in a sense, when people do their reviews for us and tell us how fabulous they are, we actually do expect evidence, as people have said. But the sort of evidence that you're talking about, as you rightly said, is quite difficult, especially if it's longitudinal. We're going to open for Q&A. Please put your questions in. But I think from the panel, we've sort of, I think, understood really that the strength of our higher education system won't be judged solely by the quality of our graduates, so important that is, its input into the economy and employment, but really how it enhances the flourishing of individuals and society through a social cohesion that is the hallmark of Australian democracy and that enables us to turn out wonderful human beings and citizens that do tackle all the incredible wicked problems that our century and our time confronts us with. So we're going to turn over to Q&A. I am, if I can work out how to do it. And the first question, and I'll just throw it open to the panel, does the survey on racism reveal whether unis are failing in fighting racism or potentially doing better than other comparable institutions across society?
Thanks for that question. Look, it's a hard one to answer because it's both yes and no. So firstly, does the survey reveal whether unis are failing in fighting racism? I think that it's going to be a pretty hard reading, like you said, and the data that has come out, I would say, shows that unfortunately we are failing at fighting racism across the sector. In terms of doing potentially better than other institutions across society, so the survey did ask questions regarding experiences of racism outside of universities. So there is a little bit of data there. Off the top of my head, I think the locations or places in society where there was the most racism happening was actually places like public transport and social media. I don't know off the top of my head about other comparable institutions. I'd need to look at that. But to that I would say, obviously, universities shouldn't be comparing themselves to social media or public transport, right? More is expected of our institutions. And so that's a tricky comparison to make.
Just the second one, this is giving me the don't call us, we'll call you. Many students are not aware of TEQSA or the NSO. How can we as staff, professionals and academics actually bring awareness to these organisations? I was thinking that earlier in one of the sessions. I think it was the students' session, which suggested students don't know about TEQSA, they don't know about the Student Ombudsman. So that should be something that happens in orientation, if not before, and we should ensure that that sort of advice and information is available all the way through. And just one quickie. Each presentation has got a comment on leadership. How can we improve that? Now, that's an impossible question, but I think all the speakers, and in fact everyone today, has talked about culture and leadership. Culture is very, very difficult to change, but we have to start at grassroots. And our panellists have given us some excellent examples of how we might go about doing that. So hands together to our panellists and go on finding the magic wand.
Are we done? Are we done?
That's it.
That's good.
Thank you, sorry.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that fantastic session. And thank you very much to the panellists as well. It's really great to have this open and rich conversation and to bring up the challenges to the surface so that we can find the opportunities at our institutions, because if we can find them at the institutions, and they'll be able to be thought through, sort of worked through society. So the next panel is on international education and transparency, risk, integrity and quality. And the chair is Jen Bahen, who will introduce the session and then take some questions through the Slido Q&A. So please welcome Jen. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's amazing to be following such a wonderful panel. My name is Jen Bahen. I'm the Executive Director for Regulatory Operations at TEQSA. I'm also a keen... Oh, I will move down one. I don't need to be separated. I'm also a keen internationalist myself, and it's my privilege and honour to host this panel session on international education this afternoon. For much of today, we've stayed at home, looking at the Australian domestic landscape. We're going to take you on an overseas journey now from the comfort of your chairs in this auditorium. I'll be joined on this trip by 3 amazingly experienced co-pilots. I did think to look up their flying hours of experience, but I got to close to 100 years of experience and I decided to stop. I'm going to introduce my panellists not so much on their extraordinary CVs, and they are extraordinary, and I encourage you to look them up if you don't already know them, but by the contributions that they'll make to this panel here today. So firstly, we're joined by the Honorary Julian Hill, who is the Assistant Minister for International Education. And while I said I wasn't going to talk CVs, if you've worked in international education for any more than 10 minutes, you will have come across Julian. So we're very grateful that you've joined us today, Assistant Minister. Julian will give views on the Australian Government perspective on international education, both on and offshore. Then to give provider experiences on managing and mitigating risks in international education, both on and offshore, I'm joined by Professor Alec Cameron, the Vice-Chancellor of RMIT University, and Mr. Rob Regan, the Managing Director Australia of Kaplan International. We're going to start by, we're going to explore 3 topics today: risk, integrity and quality, and hopefully have time to take some questions from Slido at the end. I'm going to start by looking at a word we've heard a lot about today, and that is risk. It's a word my 5-year-old can now spell because of my role at TEQSA. So I'll start with Assistant Minister Hill. So, Assistant Minister, the international education environment, and indeed the geopolitical environment, has changed rapidly over past years. Whilst Australia's reputation as a global leader in different forms of international education, both on and offshore, is rightly celebrated, our sector also doesn't operate without risk. What are some of the key risks that you're seeing today?
Is the microphone working? Yeah. Good. Hello. My flying hours are good today. I got up at 3:45 a.m. in Perth, and here we are. My excuse for not having a tie, though, was the flight, although I did better, actually, than the AFR summit, where I managed to turn up in Sydney and forgot my suit. So here we go. My Chief of Staff, we discovered, actually we're the same size, so I did manage to get a suit. It was a moment, but my advisor doesn't have a tie, so here we are. Look, just a few things. I just want to put a few issues on the table and leave time for questions. There's one big risk which sits outside TEQSA, although there are dual sector providers here, which is a lot of the behaviour we're still seeing at the bottom end of the private vet sector. I've made some remarks that I won't repeat around that. Much of the bill that is sitting in the Parliament, which we hope will pass the Senate next week, is around giving ASQA the power, your companion regulator, to address many of those risks that we're seeing. It is very, very important for the sector that bill pass, particularly for the reputable providers. And I made some other comments thinking about future market structure in vet. There's a message also that I just want to touch on, which relates to most people here. I'm also sworn into Home Affairs, so sit over student visa processing. Each week, I do look very carefully at the student dashboards. Probably 6 weeks ago, I started raising an eyebrow. That started to turn in the last 2 weeks into a bit of a shake of the head at some of the emerging issues that I'm seeing in South Asia. So I just want to be very clear with everyone that if anyone thinks that this government or myself or Jason or Tony Burke would sit on their hands for 2 years and do nothing, as we saw the previous government do when we see inappropriate use of the visa system and they've got rocks in their head. There's been a spike in fraud in passports in recent weeks, which a note went out to providers that everyone would have got. I've instructed the department to start sampling at large quantities applications from a number of South Asian countries, including English language testing, genuine student entry. The English language testing sampling started on Monday. And I've also asked the department to start sampling students from China who are coming to the GO8 under streamlined visa requirements to get a statistically valid sample of some of the community feedback which we hear. So I just want to be very clear that we are not going to sit by if we see emerging integrity risks, and I do reserve the right to adjust evidence levels out of cycle based on the data. Just the other couple of risks. There are risks in the non-university higher education provider sector around the financial viability. Both some providers who are being held to ransom by onshore agent behaviour and they're effectively cash flowing their existence, kicking the can down the road. That's not sustainable. There is a structural imbalance for some providers between their commencement levels and their actual levels. There's concerns around transfers onshore, which we're having a look at, mechanisms. But then there's those broader issues of quality, and I'll just finish on these couple of points. Minister Clare, in his speech, stole one of the things that I was going to highlight, but really to re-emphasise that student experience survey data, the QUILT data, does raise a bunch of really interesting questions. The divergence between the top and the bottom for international student experience is around 24-25%. It's big. And Jason rightly observed you could draw a bit of a correlation, inverse correlation between rankings and student experience. I suspect you could run a bit of a lens over percentage of students on campus and student experience. That's not to say that disciplines can't have large percentage of international students and do well. There's evidence there. But I do think it's something we really need to reflect on. Success requires integrity, quality and a great student experience. So I'm very interested in that data and what we need to learn from it and what TEQSA can add to that conversation.
Thank you. We are going to hear from Rob shortly on a provider perspective in relation to the types of risks that you outlined, but we're equally here to also talk about offshore delivery. So I'll invite Alec to make a comment. RMIT's got a diverse set of transnational education programs offshore, from large collaborative programs to big campuses. What are the main risks you're seeking to mitigate when you look at transnational education?
Thanks, Jen. There are multiple issues that pertain to transnational education, including integrity and quality, but seeing their later agenda items, I'll focus on the one which is differentiated for transnational education, and that is the fact that when we're operating offshore, my perspective very strongly is we are there at the invitation, at the behest of the local country in which we are operating, right? And we never lose sight of that. And in managing those relations offshore, we have proven to be very reliant on great support from the Australian government in terms of the embassies, in terms of DFAT, in terms of the Department for Education, education council roles, as you've held, Jen, and to be quite frank, TEQSA, right? So if I pick on, for instance, our largest offshore activity in Vietnam, the relationship with the government there is critical for us in terms of how we undertake our business. They have regulatory expectations of us. First and foremost, their expectation is that we are in good standing with our national regulator here, TEQSA, in Australia. And in support of that, Mary Russell, the CEO of TEQSA, visited Vietnam early this year, and it was great support for us to be able to talk both to Vietnamese regulators to advise them on the development of regulation within the Vietnam market, but also to, in some sense, assist us in maintaining our good standing with the Vietnamese government based on our good standing with TEQSA here. So we do occasionally come up against issues where the local regulation is at odds with, when I say it's at odds, it's not consistent with TEQSA regulation, right? TEQSA, in my very strong personal view, we have a mature form of regulation which is very much based on, let me say, measurement and reporting of outcomes, right? In a less mature context, there are other regulators which really look just at inputs, right? How many square metres you have per student, how much money you spend per student, in some sense measuring those inputs. I think our approach is superior, and it's clear that what we are about is providing Australian regulated education abroad, so that when those tensions arise, our first and primary responsibility is to make sure about the integrity of the Australian education we're providing, but at the same time we need to recognise and address there will be times when there will be some, let me say, inconsistencies and hence tensions that we need to manage with the local government.
Thanks, Alec. And you've mentioned the support that TEQSA has given in country. If anyone wants to talk about that sort of work, please grab me afterwards. We're doing work in Southeast Asia, China and India specifically. Rob, you've heard Assistant Minister's views on risks in relation to onshore students. What does that look like at Kaplan?
Yeah, thanks very much. We're very happy to be held to account for the behaviours that we have in terms of international student recruitment, just like anyone else. We have quite a robust and robust risk framework that we implement across the organisation, in that we are a US-held company. There are many layers of infrastructure that we must go through in terms of our reporting processes, but we look at that sort of risk through the same lens as we look at any other risk, and that's through basically a regulatory framework where we comply with ESOS, the National Code, the RTO standards, the Higher Education Standards Framework. We have very clear admissions policies and processes that we implement through the organisation. Something that we have implemented that we are very robust about is our agent management processes, where we have detailed cohort tracking and reporting mechanisms. On a number of occasions, we have walked away from agents who aren't holding themselves to the same standards that we have. We are able to dig down on our student performance right down to age, demographics, gender, what region they're from, even what region within countries they're from, and what agents they're from. And it allows us to implement meaningful and timeful interventions in terms of making that student outcome what those students are bought into. So we are looking at this across the board all of the time. We have a robust risk management framework where we have a live document that each of the higher ed providers document their macro and micro risks. It's an ongoing review of that is reviewed both through our management within country. I have to take that up the line to the US and to the UK and even to the ultimate parent company. And compliance with the local regulation is something that is front of mind and something that we continue to change our processes to comply with. We welcome the regulation that's coming, but we want to make sure that it is enforced, monitored and policed properly, so that the the intent of the regulations is actually what is implemented in practice.
Thank you. You've segued beautifully to my next set of questions. We're going to talk a little bit about integrity now, and that can be interpreted in lots of different ways, related to a key theme of this conference around transparency. But topically at the moment, there's two sets of draft reforms under consideration by the Australian Parliament, with a focus on integrity in both on and offshore delivery. So I'm going to direct the next question to Assistant Minister Hill, and I hope you don't mind if I also incorporate some of the Q&A I'm seeing in live action, so we can get to questions. So the question I have, and I'm going to add a second part to this, is if they pass, what impact do you hope these reforms will have on the international education ecosystem in Australia? And we do have an upvoted question around the particular draft amendment in the ESOS bill around suspension or cancel of courses. So I wonder if you'd address that in your response as well.
Sure. These reforms overwhelmingly should have passed the Parliament 12 months ago. They sat in the Senate and, excuse me a political comment, but what we've, with varying degrees of frustration, termed the coalition of the Greens political party and the Liberal Party ganging up for whatever peculiar reason that didn't seem to have much to do with policy. Look, it was a different stage of the political cycle, so I would hope next week we get a different outcome. The reforms are not capricious, they're not, offhand. They've flowed from multiple reviews, including the Nixon review, the public version and the sealed section. Sealed section's a funny term, but it's a deadly serious report. It goes to the social licence. We saw shocking misuse of the student visa system and the international education sector, human trafficking, migration scams, labour scams, really unacceptable behaviour. The parliamentary inquiry by the Trade Subcommittee, which I played a key part in, we spent a couple of years actually listening carefully and the recommendations were thoughtful, as well as the migration strategy and feedback from ASQA and TEQSA. So there's been a lot of thought go into those measures. We removed the caps, which was the controversial part. So my answer is they have to pass, and I want them to have a significant impact. The integrity issues are still there. We've done a range of things, particularly through the visa side. We've resourced the regulators better. Your ASQA are out there doing their thing, but you need more powers. Couldn't be clearer. On the specific issue around course cancellation powers, that question was argued, I think, persuasively in the parliamentary inquiry. It's not, contrary to some of the more peculiar expert or media commentary, including from some who I think should know better. Remember, this did get through the Senate inquiry last time. It shouldn't be controversial. We removed Table A universities from it. I think that was a solution in search of a problem. But it is meant to be a reserve power, but it's very clear, and I'll choose my words carefully because I don't want to undermine the work that regulators are doing on integrity issues and investigations, but it's very clear that there is misuse in parts of the sector, and you see that reflected in a small number of very dodgy courses. So I think the case has been well made. I'd refer you to the parliamentary inquiry, the explanatory memorandum, the Senate inquiry. It's not a new proposal that's suddenly come out of somewhere. They come out of nowhere. It's been there and it's been well argued for some years.
Thank you. Rob, I might get you to comment. You started at the end to your last question, comment on how Kaplan might be preparing for the draft reforms to pass, particularly from an onshore student recruitment perspective, and then I'll go to Alec for the perspective of the proposed changes to the TEQSA Act.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. I think, we've been preparing for lots of these changes for a long time. None of this is brand new to us. So, this within our organisation, it's been a long journey trying to build a culture of compliance. And I think for some of those private providers in the room, one of your most important appointments that you can make across an organisation is your head of compliance, because in my organisation at least, if the head of compliance rings me, it's the one person that I will always answer the phone to, because that means that the operators will go to your compliance division when they're trying to work out better ways of doing things to make sure they're compliant with all of the regulations. We have a compliance team who's going around both of our providers doing internal audit spot checks with regard to agent management, with regard to our marketing and communications publications. and it's an ongoing continual improvement process of compliance across the organisation. So none of these changes are huge news to us. It's a step change, but it's not something that is a real structural change as far as we're concerned. We always think that the regulations are there to serve a purpose and we need to play within those rules. We're about maximising our student outcomes, and that won't change. But for us, it's business as usual, and rules change and we change with them.
Thank you. The draft changes before Parliament at the moment also have proposed changes to the TEQSA Act to look at regulation in relation to transnational education. So, Alec, if I could ask you, how does RMIT ensure integrity is at the heart of your diverse T&E offerings? And should the proposed changes to the TEQSA Act proceed, how will RMIT work within these changes?
Okay, if I think about integrity, for me, the fundamental premise of what we offer to students who undertake RMIT courses offshore, so either with our offshore campuses or with our partners, is that they're receiving the same quality of education, the same quality of student experience, the same curriculum, the same entrance standards, the same graduation standards, the same fundamental degree worth that they are receiving if they undertake those studies in Australia, right? So that's the fundamental point from my point of view, is we don't have two classes of RMIT degrees, offshore and onshore. We have one qualification accredited by TEQSA, and we step up to ensure that that is the case. So how do we do that, right? I suppose I'd say in the first instance, we are, as I said before, all of our programs are accredited by TEQSA. They're all under the academic governance of our academic board. So academic board approves programs, whether they're delivered in Australia, whether they're delivered overseas. It's the same process through our academic board, which sits within our governance structure. Our council is very engaged with our offshore activities. Once again, if I use the example of Vietnam, which is our largest offshore activity with 12,000 students, our council, on current run rate, attends there every second year to make sure that when they're making decisions about significant investments, and we have investments of the order of hundreds of millions of dollars in Vietnam, that they are up to speed, that they understand the environment, they understand the tenor on our campuses in terms of staff and student sentiment, they understand the regulatory position with government and so forth. So that's important, right? Having approved and set up these programs, for us, it's not a matter of set and forget, right? None of our offshore programs do not have an element of co-delivery from RMIT offshore in-country, which means we've got academics from RMIT visiting our campuses externally or our partnerships to deliver some of the component of the program overseas. So not only is there some consistency in teaching, but there's continuous, let me say, engagement of our academics in Melbourne with the activities offshore to confirm and assure us with regard to the quality of the experience and the quality of delivery which we're experiencing offshore. To assist us in that, we've also reduced our number of international partnerships, right? So we had probably 11 partnerships in the not too distant past. We've reduced that to 6 now, right? So we're looking for deeper, broader relationships. And the other thing that I'd say about those relationships in almost all cases, except for our most recent one, some of those relationships have existed for a couple of decades plus, okay? And the other thing I'd say is, and this is in the context of regulatory changes, I must admit I'm not too concerned. I mean, clearly the intention is to give TEQSA more jurisdiction with regard to T&E. I've made the comment already. I make more calls to Mary each year than I write letters to her, right? And that's because we are proactive in terms of raising issues with TEQSA in advance of actually progressing with things, right? And I think that will be the same approach for us. If we are required to get approval from TEQSA, I have no concern because we wouldn't do anything offshore without having a conversation with TEQSA before embarking on that initiative.
Thank you. Assistant Minister Hill.
Yeah, I'll just add a comment because this is a new bit of the bill that wasn't there in the previous bill, which is the requirement effectively to get authorisation from and then keep TEQSA informed of transnational delivery, in simple terms. To be really frank, I'll tell you the little story in a nutshell. I read the bill. It's very old-fashioned. I do read clauses in bills. Yeah. And I spoke to Jason after I'd read it, so a few days before we're about to introduce it, I said, mild freak out about this because it was new, and I had a healthy degree of scepticism, to be frank, about red tape and over-engineering. So we actually put a hold on the bill for 2 weeks. We met with Mary, we worked it through, and actually once you understand the detail of it, I was comforted. Because it's not a requirement, contrary to some of the stuff flying around, it's not a requirement for TEQSA to approve every course or every country. It's simply, frankly, the policy problem we're trying to solve is to make sure that the regulator simply has a line of sight to what you're doing offshore. That's it. So that then they can do their normal risk-based regulation. That's in everyone's interest, because if one provider does one dumb thing in a market, it can wreck the reputation for everyone. So we need to be able to say, to back up Alec's point, to any country in the world that if an Australian degree is being offered or delivered, that it is exactly the same quality standard as if it was being done anywhere in Australia. Clearly, the regulator needs to know where delivery has happened so they can put their risk model over it and keep an eye on it, that's all. So grandfathering authorisation for existing providers, it's really a reporting line of sight mechanism, no more.
Yeah, that's right.
Is that right? Did I get it right?
Yes, you did.
Okay, good.
Well
Right.
done.
Yeah. I read the bill.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to our briefing. It's time to. That's a very cheeky comment from a public servant to a minister.
Always listen to your briefing.
Yes. It's time to celebrate. The next set of questions will look at quality and the sort of vision we have for international education and the things we do that we're proud of in international education. So I've got some questions for the panel. I'm going to try to incorporate one of the Q&As as well. So I'll add a part B to the question I had previously shared with panel members, and everyone will get a part B. But I'll start again with Assistant Minister Hill. You're a passionate advocate for international education in Australia. You have been for as long as I've been in international education, which has been a number of years. So thinking beyond risk and integrity, can you share your vision for a high-quality sector that encompasses both on and offshore provision? And my part B is, how can we reflect student voices in that? So that part B is a warning to everyone.
Okay, well, here we go. Look, I don't want to take too much time to answer this because I could talk at length. I'm very passionate about this.
I will stop you if I need to.
Indeed, but I also want to allow a little bit more time for other Q&A and stuff that's coming up because I'm watching the screen there and there's a bunch of issues. Look, it is a great Australian success story, and my vision would be, firstly, with the social licence question, we want to move as close as we can. You never get to nirvana, but you really want to move back to a place where Australians, domestic students, their parents, the community feel proud of this sector. And at times, as I've talked at length in other forums, and I won't get partisan about it, but at times it has become, and unfortunately I saw in the newspaper again this morning, the next shot across the bows from the very conservative flank of the opposition is we're going to go back to bashing up international students to blame for a whole bunch of problems. It does us no good when we go through those cycles. So I really want to get back to a broader set of social licence kind of mandates for the sector that people feel proud of it. To that end, we do need to focus, and I touched on it, Jason touched on it, we'd encourage TEQSA and providers to think about it, to have a look at the quality of the student experience. If there's one message out of this, quality, not quantity. We are in an era of managed growth. We're not going to back off from managing the student numbers and the size and the shape of the onshore student market. T&E is a different proposition. As long as the quality's there, you don't have the same numerical considerations, knock yourselves out. Great for economic development, great for soft power, great for international aid and development objectives, that's good. But let's be realistic. I've seen some of the questions floating there. If anyone thinks that the government's going to back off from managing the size of the sector onshore, they're really living in dreamland. We have to manage the size of the sector. So I want people to be proud of it. But the other thing I'd just point to that we are thinking about is how we can really position the sector as part of our statecraft going forward. There's foreign affairs, there's defence, there's trade, there's aid, the four traditional pillars of our statecraft. International ed, the thing that we've built over 30, 40 years, is in its own way an enabler of those other pillars, but also increasingly a domain in its own right. It's part of Brand Australia, the world's classroom, however you want to put it. I want to see that articulated and valued and reflected because it's something that Australia does really well that serves so many of our policy objectives. But there's no point talking about soft power We've educated the elite of Southeast Asia, when increasingly that's not true. And that goes to market diversification. And if we don't make sure that the students who leave have a good experience. We haven't built any soft power then. So that sense of two tribes on campuses, we've got to keep trying to close that gap. I'll finish on this point. Some of you will have heard this before, but it does make me sad as an Australian when international students leave our country after some months or years here and feel like they never connected with the Australian community or never made an Australian friend. I wouldn't want that experience for my daughter in a foreign country, and I'd hope that we could stay focused on making sure that students have a really good experience here at a human level.
And I think that statecraft is really critical. When I was working offshore in the embassies as the Council for International Education, there wasn't a high-level visit, a bilateral agreement, a free trade agreement that education wasn't the heart of. So to look at that domestically as well would be amazing. Alec, I'll go to you next. Again, celebrating quality. What is the quality initiative or measures that you are proudest of in RMIT's T&E delivery, and how do you ensure that student voices are at the heart of that?
Okay, I'm going to cheat if I can, Jen, and actually give a few that we're particularly proud of.
Yes.
So, I think one of the things I'd say about T&E, it's a long-term game, right? So, one of the things I'm very proud of is that we have relationships in, probably 5 of our 6 ongoing international partnerships have been in existence for 25 years or more, right? So we've been 25 years in Vietnam, we've been 35 years in Singapore, we've been comparable period of time in Shanghai and so forth. And so firstly, I'm very proud of those long, deep relationships because, as I said, there have been times on those journeys when it's not been easy, and we have stayed the course and we've built trust over time. I would have to be proudest of Vietnam because it is the exemplar, I believe, in terms of Australian transnational offshore education at the moment. Monash's new increased commitment in Malaysia, I think, will challenge that, so we will respond to that challenge. So that's the good thing. That's the good thing about a competitive market. So very proud of what we've achieved in Vietnam and the difference we make and our positioning in Vietnam, where we think of ourselves very much as being part of Brand Australia, and we are without doubt the leading international education provider in Vietnam, and that's recognised by the government and by the market there. We're aware at the same time that it's not one size fits all. Something else we are particularly proud of is our most recent partnership, which is with BITS Pilani in India, where I think already after just 2 years of operation, we have over 300 students. We've had our first cohort of students have done their 2 years in India and have now come to Australia, and we've had 88 out of 92 students make that transition, and that's a 95% transition rate, which I think is just outstanding. And I think we've already positioned ourselves as the leading T&E provider for Australian universities in India. And the last thing I'd say is, and ultimately I think this is the real test from my point of view in terms of quality, the students who undertake our transnational education and then articulate to Melbourne do better, on average, than the cohort that they join. So this is not a compromise in quality. This is a recognition that actually, our market appeal offshore for transnational education is of the same quality, and our delivery is of the same quality, which ensures that those students come and do better than the cohort that they join in Australia.
Thank you. And Rob, from an onshore student perspective, what is the quality initiative or measure that you're proudest of in Kaplan, Australia, and how do you build student voices into your work?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. I think, I mentioned it a little bit earlier in my comments. We've spent a lot of time looking at data on student outcomes, student progress, and we've built some really robust cohort tracking mechanisms that get reported through to the academic board at each of their meetings, also to the corporate board at each of their meetings, and it's had a huge impact on our quilt results and our student success metrics. Not only with that, it's allowed us to manage our agent network much more robustly. We've been able to move up to a risk rating of 1 for a private provider, which is a great sign of how this is working, but also in a time where some of us think that our revenues are capped. It's allowed us to focus on the student journey and to significantly decrease our attrition rate down to one provider is 11% and the other is 19%. And of course, the flow-on effect of that to our revenue ongoing revenue basis is huge and leaves us in a much better position in terms of focusing on the student outcomes and providing what the students are after. And our quilt ratings as a result of this breakdown of the student data, agent data, etc., way up from what they used to be, and it's all driven by the data analysis that we're doing on an ongoing basis.
Great, thank you. We're going to jump into Q&A now. We've got lots of questions, so we're going to move through them reasonably quickly. I'll pick the person to direct them to, but I'm very happy for other panel members to pop up their hand and make comments. So, Assistant Minister Hill, I'm going to ask you first to talk about the relationship between, I'm not going to read the question directly, but the relationship between international students and housing in Australia, and invite you to make any comments on that matter. It's the top-ranked question, so we're going to ask it.
So, I'll be cheeky and read the question directly. Okay. Why does the government continue to conflate international students with the housing crisis in Australia? It's been floating up the top. So the reason I want to read it is because I want to punch that directly. We don't. We don't. Others do, but we don't. There's a but. Of course, this is a statement of the obvious. Of course, aggregate demand adds to housing pressures. Of course it does. It's nonsense to say it doesn't. That's why net overseas migration, we're very focused on reducing net overseas migration back to normal levels. Think about it like this. Net overseas migration bounced around before COVID, and then the borders shut, and it went negative for the first time since World War II. And then the borders reopened and it spiked because everyone offshore came back, including Australian citizens who count as a net overseas migrant, because it's a statistical measure. And now it's trending back towards normal levels. But we are very focused on getting that overseas migration down. And of course, international students play a part in that. So I just really want to be clear on the frame. We don't blame individual groups of migrants. We don't blame individuals, one. Two, you're living in fantasy land, though, if you want to just run an argument that the government's job is somehow to let all providers recruit as many students as they want because there's some God-given right. There's not. The government's job is to act in the public interest and the national interest, and that's what we'll continue to do. Therefore, when you put those two things together, that's why we've had a very strong focus, particularly with the public universities in this round, in allocating any additional commencements to institutions that are serious about building new housing. And that means not just drawing pretty pictures, means actually getting a planning permit, and having the financing from University Council or Senate and getting it constructed. There was great data came out actually this morning from the Property Council and the Student Accommodation Council saying that the government's policies are now pointing in the right direction. We've seen a significant spike in the last few months in the number of student housing beds under construction and now in the development pipeline. So that's a good thing. But I just want to be really clear on that we're not blaming individual students, but some of the advocacy we receive is frankly unhinged.
We'll move on to the next question. Is there...
Sorry, I should say I've got an appointment because my ear's been blocked for 2.5 weeks and I'm a bit grumpy because I can't hear properly and there's lots of drugs and sprays involved and I've got to go to the ENT and try and make my ear work again, so that's why I sound a bit grumpy.
No.
Oh, no,
yes.
That's normal.
We're going to talk about agents now. The next sort of top-ranked question. Ask the question about an agent regulatory framework. Is there any intention to introduce an agent regulatory framework to protect students and providers? I will, Assistant Minister, ask you to tackle that first, but we might also just ask for reflections of a provider perspective of managing agents as well. Rob, we've heard from you, but I invite other perspectives as well. But Assistant Minister Hill, we'll start with you.
Yes, the government said we will give consideration to this as part of our response to one of the Nixon Review's specific recommendations, recommending that there needed to be some kind of regulatory model for agents. We haven't settled on an answer to that, but I'd put the question back to people very genuinely. It's something I've bounced around for probably 10 years. It's a heritage conversation. We go in circles. It's difficult to escape the proposition that there needs to be some ability to kick people out of the sector, because at the moment my proverbial dog could be an education agent. But obviously there's a regulatory cost burden question. Providers already under the ESOS framework, you guys could fill this in better than I, but you're already obliged to keep very detailed records of all of the agents, how much you pay them, and so on. So the lightest possible touch model is something I'd be interested in. There's also good examples of industry-led self-regulatory, soft regulatory options. That's how we did buy now, pay later, frankly. You know, we went, it looks like credit, walks like credit, smells like credit, it's probably credit. The sector eventually got it together. We got to about 93, 94% of the BNPL providers opted in, and then, you know, had a bit of a look at the 6% who weren't, and then we made it hard regulation. So there's lots of different journeys in this. But the commission stuff in the bill does allow us to amend the ESOS code and wipe out the commissions for onshore student transfers. That is our intention. We've said that very clearly. And it'll also give the department the power to gather data. Now, I'm old-fashioned. I think public policy should be informed by evidence and data, not the vibe of the thing. So we can gather evidence and data about what's actually happening in the market to determine whether further interventions are needed. But we've seen this movie, and someone says they're mortgage brokers. I could go back to, you know, drug companies used to give the doctors free holidays and TVs and stuff to prescribe their drugs, but we went, that's not on, and wiped it out. So there are numerous examples of where an intermediary has corrupted the market. Certainly we believe the onshore behaviour has reached that point. What the lightest touch option that may be further than we currently have is a question I'm really open to getting good feedback on. Always better to do it yourself than have someone do it to you, but there you go.
I might ask Rob and Alec for on-stage reactions to the idea of an agent regulatory framework.
I'll take it first, Alec. But I think, Minister, that you know, your last point was a good one. It needs to be data-driven, I think. And part of the new reforms was being able to get that data to get visibility and transparency across what's happening with agents and providers. And we're all for that, because I think a lot of us in this room are getting penalised because there is no transparency across the sector with regard to the relationships and payments being made between agents and providers. So as long as it's data-driven, I don't think you'd get much pushback across the sector. I think that's a really good starting point. You know, I worry about the implementation of the new reforms and how we get visibility. You know, I think we've seen some of this play out before, where agents and some providers find a way to keep things as non-transparent as possible. And how we get around that, I think, is going to be the key in terms of building a platform as to how we manage this going forward. But I think as a sector, we're all for it.
Yeah, look, Jen, my view would be, you know, I'm very much where the Minister said, you know, I think it's better if you can regulate yourself rather than requiring the government to regulate you. And I think it's regrettable, because I think that, you know, I think most universities do this well, and other providers beyond universities. But it is always going to be the odd apple that spoils the bunch. And I'm very conscious at RMIT we are very deliberate in terms of reviewing our agent arrangements and ensuring that if there's any agents who are not compatible with our quality and reputation and standing, then we don't continue with them. So, you know, I'm very relaxed about how we would sit in a regulatory, if there was an imposition of a regulator. I would like to think that the sector could self-regulate, but, you know, that doesn't always occur.
Just quickly on that too, we really define ourselves through the business that we say no to with agents too. We have a really stringent agent ratification process that we follow, and, you know, we think we're very happy to say no to agents who we don't think uphold our standards, like you, Alec.
3 cheers.
Yeah, great.
What he said.
We'll go to the next ranked question, which is now at the top of our screen. I do have a question saying, are we deleting Slido questions? I only am so that we can actually see the top ranked questions on the little screen that we have here. If we're giving greater powers to regulators, why does the Minister need powers that can bypass these regulators? And I think, Assistant Minister, this is referring to some powers that the Minister has in the draft ESOS legislation around course suspension and cancellation, which you have already addressed, but I'll give you the opportunity to make any other comments if you'd like.
I'll just make a couple of normative comments as someone who's worked in many different areas of policy and regulatory constructs. In just about every piece of legislation, even where there's regulators or every domain, ministers on behalf of executive government will often hold national interest powers. I'm also sworn in as, you know, to the immigration portfolio. The system couldn't run without ministerial intervention powers and the exceptions and extreme cases. We saw the Nazi visa cancellation yesterday. If you leave all that stuff always up to courts and appeals and regulators, then there are legitimate circumstances where executive government needs to intervene. I used to be in charge of metropolitan planning strategy for Melbourne. Terrific job. It was a really wonderful role. But again, the planning system relies on, yes, there's tribunals and there's planning panels and there's councils and there's this and that and delegates, but it relies on the minister having a set of powers to intervene in exceptional circumstances. The key, to my mind, is that those powers are not used capriciously, that there's the right safeguards around them, there's the right regulatory constructs, and that there's absolute transparency. So that, that is provided for, in my view, in the bill. And I'd also point out that ministers already hold a number of these powers. Section 97 of the ESOS Act gives me in my immigration portfolio, some pretty strong powers. So let's just keep it all in context. Some of the stakeholder commentary that's been amplified, and it's a legitimate debate to have in some of the media outlets, is kind of a bit divorced from the normal construct, that these are exceptional circumstances, kind of powers. They're not in, we're not going to see someone wandering around like Barbarella kind of randomly shooting things. This is a proper cabinet government, it's a proper regulatory construct, they'll be properly used, but the case has been made for years for why there needs to be some additional powers.
Thank you. I want to get to the next rank question, but we'll do it reasonably quickly, and I'll slightly broaden it up. It's around mental health of international students, I'm going to broaden it in a way that's whether they're waiting for a visa or whether they're already studying. I wonder, and Rob, I might start with you, ask for reflections on how you support the mental health of international students. The same question to each panel member in about a 10-second reflection, and then we'll wrap up.
10 seconds.
Sorry, and I don't want to underdo that, but...
Yeah, no, we have a lot of processes in place with regard to supporting not only the mental health but physical health of our onshore international students. We have a partnership with Sonda that is available to all of our international students across our portfolio. We also put the onus on our teachers and all our what we call student success people within our colleges to make sure that they're checking in with all of our students and that they're okay. And we have a process, of course, when we find out that someone is suffering a mental health episode of sorts that we follow. So it is one of our major initiatives that we look after in terms of ensuring that our international students are getting the service that they're after.
Yeah, look, I'd say the same, Jen. We look very carefully at the International Student Barometer and, to make sure that our international student satisfaction in terms of their experience, their issues, their outcomes, their administrative support are all at the highest level, and I'm confident that we are, very well placed in that regard.
Any last reflections, Assistant Minister?
Oh, just to point out also the safety net role of states and territories in this regard. I used to run Study Melbourne in a former life 1,000 years ago, and they still have the Study Melbourne Centre with trained social workers. The work that big providers do and the scale that you can bring to invest in these is frankly just different from a lot of the smaller providers or scattered campus models, and all the states and territories need to have that kind of safety net for when things go wrong. It's frankly not a role, I won't bore you with all the architectures, National Student Ombudsman and all that, but it's frankly not a role that the Commonwealth is best placed to provide. That sort of student experience side of things and safety and wellbeing is much better sat with the states and territories.
Yeah, no, great. We'll hear from the NSO later on today.
Great.
I want to say an enormous thank you to this panel for being so open to answering all of the questions. I'm going to give a special thank you to Assistant Minister Hill for getting up at 3 o'clock to come to us. Thank you.
So I want to echo that as well. Thank you very much for a fantastic panel, another jam-packed panel with lots of goodness and lots of thinking and fantastic responses and insights. So we now have another break until 3:45, afternoon tea. So please be back here at 3:45 for another jam-packed session. It'll be the last session for the day. Thank you. Well done.
Yeah.